Thank you so much. I have the honour of standing up, which makes me feel a little bit anomalous. I feel I should be in a vase. It's a great honour to be here, and of course it is, with a certain melancholy that sometimes flowers represent. A part of me has gone in the same way that, flowers go. And so Polixeni was the author of this work, which and is also gratefully the person to whom the book is dedicated. So very poetic, and it's just incredible for me to be here. Since we're talking about Polixeni, I thought I'd begin with some remarks about flowers, because Polixeni used to say that men only give flowers to women to say sorry. I never gave her flowers. Though fortunately for her, there were lots of women who came to the house, and there were always flowers in the house, and I was usually given the task of being the steward of these flowers. So my knowledge of flowers is still alive. But, flower-challenged males, and I notice we boys are a little in the minority in this room, but we feel loved. And, men flower-challenged. And thank you, Tansy, for saying how flowers are gendered. So we men often have the embarrassment of not so much as knowing the names of the flowers, even though we might admire their forms, and or at least not being able to match the names with the blooms. So, when men feel in any way inadequate, they act out, and so hence the sort of somewhat vengeful disposition sometimes to flowers. It's when they, consider them a total waste of time, and the richest antipathy, to the point of, polemics against wastefulness and the sort of unnaturing that cut flowers represent. Amputated nature, amputated horticulture, melancholy symbols of vanitas. So, what I love about the book is it follows this ingenious idea to be where the application of the ideas favours pictures, but the structure favours flowers. What a brainwave. So it is encyclopedically organised, alphabetically, to follow the flower. So, and I think there's something more than just a clever structure at work here, that it is, I think, poetic. As all good books, I feel some shame here as an author talking in front of an editor.
So you should.
I know. Well, I think, anyway, good books have two themes, and but the good ones bundle these two themes as if they're one. And it's a very clever thing. And I think you've got a trinity, in fact, in the book here, because it's simultaneously a history of flowers in Australian gardens. It makes gesture to that. Then, second, it's flowers in a suite of pictures. And then third, it narrates effectively the history of art itself, with its independent story of styles and influences and reflections of social change. So, because art is a very compelling topic, it tends to subsume everything that you put inside it. And it's got this sort of seriousness that kind of co-opts all its ingredients. I think, especially with a genre like still life, so a lot of these flowers, of course, are appearing in still life. I mean, they appear all over the history of art in subject pictures as well. But predominantly, the interest in flowers is still life, a topic. And still life is a particular genre that, in effect, talked to the art world to say, what's mighty about a picture is not its subject matter. So it's a bit of a paradox here. That, and this claim to the autonomy of art is greatly magnified in modernism. So, when Cézanne famously said, "I will astonish Paris with an apple," and it wouldn't profit an art historian to go back and say, well, let's talk about the history of apples. Or any other fruit, even though, it's interesting because, in an apple he chose something that, I think one of his favourite fruits was an orange, actually, because it was very spherical, and so very orange. But, it's essential form, so he loved that about it. So this choice of the apple, I guess, contrasts with sort of, if you think of fruit in Baroque art, they would favour the sort of multiplicity of grapes, or pomegranates that kind of spill out and have lots of seeds and ampleness, and they're sort of voluptuous fruits, not that tart sort of Johnny that Cézanne would paint. So fruits. This to me is kind of interesting, that the humility of, or the humbleness of what you put on the little table to make the still life is, in effect, giving itself to the artwork. It says, why Cézanne astonishes Paris with the apple is that the apple in his hands has this mighty presence that's bulked out with these brushstrokes that sort of feel their way around chromatically what is a kind of slightly shifting kind of, bit of the apple is a little bit redder than that part that's very green. And so, there's all this language of how to make the form animated in space, and it's got this incredible sort of, it's astonishing, from coming from a tradition that's full of grapes and pomegranates. So this story about what artists are doing with this stuff, and particularly with flowers. Flowers are a little bit different because, and different in art history because, in the same way that you don't have flowers in the house the way that you have fruit in the house, that you have to bring the flowers into the house on purpose, whereas you could coincidentally have fruit in the house, though the fruit is there to eat. No people eat flowers, but it's unusual and it requires a special chef. So the convention is that the flower is really, it has this life already before it gets to art. It's a meaning-giving proposition. It's already semantically rich because it is intended. So it's a horticulture that embodies intention, and it's not just as in hunger with the fruit. So it kind of follows this when it gets to art that these sort of semantic imperatives are there. They're installed in the picture, and in the same way that it's it's sort of cultivated, even if it's brought from outside. And it's a funny thing. I think a lot about flowers in relation to the ones that we have. Let's say people have in their garden. We have a garden-challenged Fitzroy neighbourhood, my own. So flowers are few and far between in that hood. However, I remember the time from suburban Melbourne where gardening was much more practiced. I'm a cyclist, so I go a lot around the suburbs on my rounds, and I see an awful lot of gardens. They're very much more professional than they used to be. But you know what? They're being gardened by professionals. It's outsourced. And so Dad, this Aussie archetype of Dad, is not as green. The fingers are not as green as they used to be. And this, and coming back to the beginning, that this knowledge of flowers is Thank you. Yes, it's loosening from its purchase on our green fingers. Yes. So, and this is very sad, and it's all about this franchise with men, I feel, because men did have a way in when they were gardening. And as they're gardening less, they have more vengefulness toward the flowers. And I look back historically, because like Tansy and Penelope, I'm a historian, and so I maybe look back to earlier days still, and especially I notice in Renaissance paintings are full of flowers, but they become the subject of art like exclusively. Like you can have a picture that has almost nothing but flowers in it from the 17th century, just leading up to the 17th century. Kind of epidemic of flowers. I mean, flowers are always popular in, say, Italian poetry. But if you take a poet like Torquato Tasso, so he's this later 16th century poet, there are about 300. So, leaving aside his Gerusalemme Liberata, which is a great, enormous long poem, like an epic, but just his Rime alone, there are about 300 references to flowers. There are over 100 references to rose, the word rose, and over 100 to lily. So just think, like, lots and lots of his. That's just one poet, okay?
That's Shakespeare.
Lots, just enormous. So Baroque poet between, and sometimes our poets will not just talk. So they love the simile. So one of their favourites is, of course, the mouth that is like a rose. That's because it's like the lips are like petals or something. It's lubricious actually. And the skin is like that of the lily, like the white of the lily and so on. So there's all these parallels between, and often, again, gendered. But sometimes they will also just have flower over flower. I had just pulled out a little bit from Tommaso Stigliani. So he's from the 17th century. Talking about, and I'll just quote here, the fresh hyacinth smiles, the snowy jasmine, the heather smiles, tinted with amorous pallor, the narcissus on the bank, and I can't translate the calta, it's a region of Italy, but anyway, I don't know what that is, smiles among fronds, the suave amaranth, the pale violet, the flexible acanthus. So just like a Baroque painting, the one spilling over the other. Just imagines all these flowers in his poem. And so I also thought of a moment too. Just tell me if I'm going beyond my time.
Wonderful.
There's something about flowers that makes me think of childhood, and so I come from maybe one of the first flower-deprived upbringings, because my dad was a gardener. But here's the catch: he was a native gardener. So he was one of the earlier adopters of a garden that disavows the imitation of Schönbrunn. The suburban garden with its beds that looks a little bit like Versailles, and this was all, in a sense, I think, dismissed as a legitimate Australian garden, which instead should reflect Indigenous existence. And especially, it was already the discourse in the 1960s, would you believe, that these plants required far less water. They're the logical choice, and besides, they have a certain sort of bristly appeal. And so our garden really expunged from visibilia the whole palette. Everything that was in Monet was banished. And so it was just a quarter acre block in Murrumbina. but it was unlike most of the others because it was. And I'm thinking about the structure of this garden, you know, and I feel a little bit embarrassed now hearing, of course, that Penelope has landscape architecture is her field, but certainly the bookshop was anyway. But yeah, we all have a relation with something that is really quite daunting for everyone else. But I think the structure of the Aussie garden, as it was in my dad's hands, was really about keeping out. It was really about the screen. So the Aussie plants have lovely flowers. We had grevilleas, melaleucas, they all flower. The callistemons, and even the flowering gums. But I mean, they're up high. The blooms are fairly inaccessible up there. So instead of having the garden that is sort of at your feet, that presents carpet-like to, as it were, embrace you, you have these sorts of fortifications that act in a slightly wall-like way. So I think already there is some jiggling of perspectives that is happening in the way that is, I think, in my case, condition my ignorance of flowers. And so I come to flowers as a complete novice, as someone who stands in front of, say, a Baroque picture. And even when I'm doing, if I read, it makes no difference if I'm reading the poem in Italian or English, because I don't necessarily know what the flower is. So the word doesn't help me to look it up, because I look up the like when I go home and I look up the word caldo and find out what that is in English, it won't help me because I won't know what it looks like.
So there's no point then asking me to name each flower?
In fact, I'll flunk. And I mean, that's a rose. I can say, yeah, but which sort of rose? No, I couldn't. And that orange fella there, it's incredibly beautiful. So I come at it as naive, as an ingénu, not knowing the details. But I think this ultimately does work against us, and that we repudiate what we can't name. We reject it, especially men. Because men like to own things. So, sorry if I'm being, silly, but I feel that there is if there is gender in nature, in plants, then there is gender politics in plants. There's anger and humour and all of that. So, and I think I'm unnerved when I see a painting of flowers because I can't name the blooms. I feel there's a barrier. When you go to you mentioned, about Christ, because enough of us know, I'm a good Jew, but I know about Christ. If I don't, then I don't have the entree into that illusion, and then the flower doesn't have that meaning for me. So it's a whole chain of ignorance that we have to sort of ease into the bliss of knowledge. And that's what this book does. It's an amazing feat by going through the flower and not just through the art. I think it's a brilliant strategy because it's also reassuring to those who do know the names of the flowers, those who are the experts, because their knowledge is rewarded and celebrated as, aha, that's reflected in art. And so it doesn't matter which way you're coming at it, highly sophisticated horticulturally, or the ignoramus that I am. And just how important the book is, I think it would be very hard to overstate. And I think that it's. Recent history does suggest to me that the language of flowers is... Polly used to talk about this, that there was a language of flowers, so what you put with what conveys something. It's not just the flower, it's not like the word. Well, it is like the word in its own right. It's a bit like the G in music. It has a relationship with the C, so there's a language of music, there's a language of flowers. And so these things resonate. And I think some of that is at risk. It's knowledge, it's what's the word, endangered knowledge. So this is a very, very timely book because it reflects on an age many times when clearly men knew their blooms, like George Lambert. And, you'd find the same with, poets, T.S. Eliot and all that. They're naming flowers in their verse. This just mean a lot to them. And I feel that awareness is slipping. And I thought perhaps I should return for one last go at to speak of my incompetence in relation to Polixeni, because the series Eden, which is this marvellous game where the figure is wedged between flowers in front, flowers on her, flowers behind her. They're artificially rendered by graphic design in textiles, and the real flower, and then metaphorically the girl as flower, however you take that. The bower is this enmeshing where the figure is somehow embraced, wraparound effect of the flowers. This is a whole body of work called Eden. But before Eden, where I didn't have to do much work other than go to the florist and bring the flowers home, there were a couple of commissions where she would tell me, I want flowers. And so a case was, for instance, I don't know if you remember, but in the body of work called Wonderland, there is an image of Olympia as Little Pig. It's called Little Pig, and she's there with foxgloves. So I had to paint foxgloves, and I'd never seen a foxglove, and so I kind of did Google and all of that, and ended up painting these foxgloves in a way that flattered sort of. I used magenta and ultramarine, and fashioned these flowers as best I could. And I still look forward to the day when I will actually see a foxglove. I can't of course flatter myself as any analogy of artists, like there are famous cases where like Dürer had never seen a rhinoceros, but he drew a rhinoceros. It's a kind of aborted rhinoceros. It's not a good rhinoceros. It's very dysfunctional, unviable as a rhinoceros, but very interesting as an artwork. And we're talking about that a lot more than we would if he'd known about the rhinoceros zoologically, had zoological exact knowledge. So it's a kind of paradox there that what flowers do, and I think this is the kind of final temptation of this book, is that they make it fascinating that the flower is there. It's got a life of its own. It's a mystery plant. And the fact that it's the sort of sex part of the plant, the fact that it's that is a necessary part of life on the planet, that the bees need those flowers, that the whole cycle of life just depends on them. This is an incredibly rich thing, and I don't think even the arrogance of men will be able to neglect it, least of all after the publication of this wonderful book. It honours everything that Polly would have ever wanted, and we are just so, so delighted. But most of all, I think that it would reach into Polly's aspirations that the world is aestheticised constantly by new knowledge, new insight, new visions. And that's what you guys have done. Thank you very much. Thank you.